You think you understand how your own mind works. You make choices. You weigh options. You decide. Fine. But why do you keep making the same mistakes? Why do smart people fall for obvious errors? What stops careful thinking from actually protecting you? Most people don't ask. They say things like bias or human nature, they repeat words, but that's not an answer. When you really ask why, you find something that changes how you see thinking itself. Not as reasoning, but as a system with built-in shortcuts. It can't escape. Let me show you. Start with something simple. Don't think of a pink elephant. Not for a second. Don't picture it. Don't imagine it. Don't even start to form the image. And of course you did. The pink elephant appears immediately, not because you chose it, not because you wanted it, but because the instruction forced the concept to load first. That isn't a trick. It's a mechanical limit. The mind can't follow a command without activating the thing the command refers to, even if the command is don't. So the thought shows up before the decision can even exist. And that should bother you, because if control worked the way it feels like it works, this would be easy. You would just choose silence. But you can't, because thought generation is upstream of choice. So that's wrong one. You don't summon most thoughts. They arrive. Now wrong two. If thoughts arrive automatically, why do they feel like yours? Most people imagine a moment of selection, like you're standing in front of a shelf of thoughts, pointing at one. I'll think about tomorrow. I'll think about work. I'll think about that conversation. That's how it feels. A clean choice, a clear command. But watch what happens when you try to see the cause of a choice in real time. Pick a number from 1 to 10. Don't calculate. Don't strategize. Just pick. You picked one. Now ask yourself why that number. Not the first excuse that shows up. The real cause, what made that number appear. And the mind does something instantly. It generates a reason. I like that number. It felt random. I didn't want the obvious one. It just popped in. Notice what you didn't see. You didn't see the number being constructed. You didn't watch options competing. You didn't observe a selection process. You saw the output, and then you saw the explanation. That's the key move. The mind produces an answer, and then produces a story that makes the answer feel owned. And here's the missing bridge most people never notice. The mind can't inspect its own causes. You can observe the result of thinking, you can hear the narrative about why it happened, but the generative machinery itself is mostly invisible. Introspection gives you outputs, not the rules that produce them. So you end up believing you chose the thought because the only thing you can observe is the thought and the story attached to it. That's wrong too. You don't witness mental causes, you witness mental conclusions. Now wrong three, even if you don't choose what appears, surely you control what you focus on. Surely attention is the part you steer. But attention is not commanded. Attention is captured. Think about how often a single cue hijacks you, your name in another room, a sudden movement in the corner of your eye, a notification, a tiny uncertainty that suddenly feels urgent. You didn't decide to care, you reacted. And the reaction makes sense once you see what attention is actually for. Attention isn't built to be loyal. It's built to detect relevance. Not relevance to your plans. Relevance to the system's deeper priorities. Uncertainty, threat, opportunity, social meaning, unfinished patterns. That's what wins. And there's a number that should permanently change how you interpret losing focus. By many estimates, the mind wanders close to half the time. half. That isn't weakness. That's design. A drifting mind finds problems early. It searches the environment. It checks for what doesn't fit. So when you say, I lost attention, it's already the wrong model. You didn't lose it. It moved to what the system ranked as more relevant. And once you see that, you notice something even more unsettling. Knowledge doesn't stop capture. You can know what you're supposed to do and still be pulled elsewhere anyway. Let me make this concrete. Say the color of the ink, not the word. Red, green, blue, yellow, easy. Now do this. The word red is printed in blue ink. The word blue is printed in green ink. The word green is printed in red ink. Say the ink color, not the word. You hesitate. The wrong output wants to come first, even when you know the rule, even when you understand the task perfectly, because the automatic response fires before deliberate control can take over. And here's the part that makes it feel physical. That fast output happens in a few hundred milliseconds. The override arrives later. So by the time you feel like you decided, the first answer is already on the table. Now let me give you a proof that has nothing to do with attention or perception. Just math. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The answer that shows up for most people is immediate. 10 cents? It feels right, it's clean, it's satisfying. And notice what happens next. The mind doesn't treat that answer as a guess. It treats it as a conclusion, because it fits. If the ball is 10 cents, the bat is $1 more. That would make the bat $1.10. 10 cents plus $1.10 makes $1.20. Close enough. The story locks in. But it's wrong, because $1 more isn't $1 total. If the ball is 10 cents, the bat would be $1.10. That's a difference of exactly $1, yes. But together they don't make $1.10. They make $1.20. So the ball can't be 10 cents. The real answer is 5 cents. Ball is 5 cents. Bat is $1.05. Total is $1.10. And here's what matters. The mistake isn't a lack of intelligence. It's a speed rule. The first answer appears fast, smooth, and coherent. So the system accepts it. Then the narrator arrives and says, that makes sense. And because it sounds logical, it feels deliberate, but the cause wasn't reasoning. The cause was that the mind grabbed the easiest pattern that fit the surface and stopped searching. That's what fast thinking looks like from the inside. Not confusion, not uncertainty, confidence. A clean answer followed by a clean explanation, even when it's wrong. That's rung 3 in its purest form. Automatic output first. Correction only if something forces the system to slow down. The slow system doesn't prevent the first impulse. It comments on it. It tries to override it. Sometimes it wins, sometimes it doesn't. But the point is structural. Control is not the generator of thought. Control is the late arriving override. That's rung 3. Automatic outputs arrive first, and deliberate control is downstream. Now rung 4. If thoughts arrive automatically and attention is captured, why does it still feel like you are choosing? Because the mind edits experience into coherence. It turns reactions into reasons. It turns impulses into intentions. It turns outcomes into authorship. Look at how fast your brain does this. You pick up your phone, not after a decision, not after a plan. It's just there. And then the explanation arrives. I needed to check something, I was waiting for a message, I was just looking at the time. The story shows up instantly to make the action feel owned. And it's persuasive because it usually could be true. But plausible is not the same thing as causal. The mind doesn't need a perfect explanation. It needs one that closes the loop, because an open loop feels like loss of control. So the system manufactures closure. And here's the part most people don't believe until they see it. Sometimes the mind will defend a choice you didn't even make. Let me show you what that looks like as a scene. Two images are placed in front of you. Call them A and B. You point to A. Then the images are quietly swapped. So now you're holding B. And the person across from you says, "Great, you chose B. Explain why you preferred B." And you do. Without hesitation, reasons appear. This one feels warmer. This one looks more trustworthy. I like it more. It stands out. You're not lying. You're not trying to perform. Your mind is doing what it always does. It assumes the present outcome is yours and constructs the explanation that makes it coherent. That's the coherence engine. It doesn't ask, did I really choose this? It asks, given that this is the outcome, what story makes it make sense? And once the story exists, it feels like ownership. But wait, notice the implication. If the mind can confidently explain a choice it didn't produce, then confidence is not proof of control. Confidence is what coherence feels like. That's rung 4. The narrator doesn't just describe thinking, it claims thinking. Now, rung 5, even when you do slow down, even when you weigh options, the output can still be steered by shortcuts you don't notice. Because the mind doesn't respond to facts, it responds to representations of facts. The same reality can produce different decisions, depending on how it's framed. Here's a simple example. Imagine a medical procedure. One description says, this procedure has a 90% survival rate. Another description says, this procedure has a 10% death rate. Same numbers, same outcome, same reality. But the mind doesn't treat them the same. One frame feels safe, the other feels dangerous. Not because you did the math wrong, because the system doesn't evaluate facts first. It evaluates meaning. Survival sounds like gain, death sounds like loss, and loss carries a different weight. So you get different choices from the same information. Because the shortcut happens before deliberate analysis can take over, the mind trades accuracy for speed. Then it defends the result with reasoning, which creates one of the strangest illusions humans have. It feels like you reasoned your way to the decision. But often, you reacted to the frame, and then built an argument that matched the reaction. That's why intelligent people can disagree violently, while both feeling rational. They're not arguing over logic, they're arguing over what their systems labeled as the situation. Same facts, different mental shape, different output. And again, the narrator does its job. It makes the output feel chosen. It makes the shortcut feel deliberate. It makes the default feel like a decision. That's rung 5. You don't just think, you shortcut. And then you explain the shortcut. Now rung 6, this one is quieter. But once you see it, it shows up everywhere. The mind often answers a different question than the one you asked. Not because it's lazy, because it's efficient. Hard questions are expensive, so the system substitutes an easier one and treats the substitution like an answer. Here's what that looks like. Ask yourself, how happy am I with my life overall? To answer that honestly, you'd need a huge scan. Relationships, work, future uncertainty, meaning, comparison, regrets, identity. That's a complex evaluation. So what does the mind do? It swaps the question. It takes my life overall and quietly replaces it with something easier. How do I feel right now? Or what's the first example that comes to mind? Then it answers that easier question and delivers the result as if it answered the original. So you think you made a considered judgment, but what you actually measured was your current mood, or your most available memory, or whatever your attention was already stuck on. Hard question in, easy question answered, confidence out. And once you notice it there, you start noticing it in other places. Ask, how risky is this decision? That sounds like analysis, trade-offs, outcomes, probabilities. But the mind often swaps it for something easier. Do I feel comfortable with this? Ask, how competent is this person? That sounds like evidence, skill, track record. But the mind often swaps it for something simpler. Do I like them? The substitution is invisible from the inside because you don't experience it as a shortcut. You experience it as judgment. The narrator doesn't announce, I replace the question. It just hands you an answer that feels like it belongs. That's rung 6. You don't evaluate reality directly. You evaluate the easiest proxy your mind can generate. Now, rung 7, this is the rung that finally kills the feeling of control. Because it proves something brutal. Your behavior can be steered without you feeling steered. Your judgments can shift without you noticing them shift. Not through argument, through cues that change what feels relevant. Imagine this. You do a simple task, read words, solve a puzzle, answer a question. But beforehand, you're exposed to subtle cues, words associated with age, or speed, or politeness, or competition. Nothing dramatic, nothing you'd remember, and then your behavior changes. Not because you chose to change, because what felt natural changed. And the strangest part is you don't feel it happening. You don't experience influence. You experience yourself. Because again, the mind can't inspect its own causes. It only sees the output, then it generates the explanation. So when a cue shifts the output, the narrator doesn't say, I was nudged. It says, I chose. And it will defend the choice. It will give reasons that sound personal and real. Because they are real, they're just not the cause. That's the illusion of control in its purest form. Influence that doesn't feel like influence. Steering that happens upstream of awareness. That's rung 7. Even when something else sets your mental direction, you experience the direction as your own. Now, rung 8, this is where the system stops feeling like psychology and starts feeling like physics. Because it shows your mind can be steered by something that isn't even information, a number, a random starting point. Think about this. I'm going to give you a number, 10. Now, answer this question. What percentage of countries in the world are in Africa? You don't know the exact number, so you estimate, maybe you say 20%, maybe 30%, maybe 40%. Now I reset the scene. New number, 65. Same question. What percentage of countries in the world are in Africa? This time the estimate drifts upward. Not because you learned anything new, not because you suddenly became worse at math, but because the system didn't start from zero. It started from wherever it was placed. And from there, it adjusted. That's the trick. When you don't know an answer, the mind doesn't search the entire space of possibilities. It takes a starting point and then moves away from it in small steps until it feels reasonable. The anchor isn't evidence. It's a location, a place the mind begins the search. And here's what makes it more disturbing. After giving the estimate, the narrator still shows up. It still explains, I said 40% because Africa is big. I said 30% because there are a lot of countries. I said 50% because it feels high. The story arrives with confidence, like it always does. And it feels rational. It feels deliberate. It feels like you're reasoning. But the cause was a random starting point. Not a fact, not knowledge, not insight, just an anchor. And you can do this with almost anything. Give someone a high number, then ask them to guess the price of a product. The guess drifts upward. Give someone a low number, ask the same question. The guess drifts downward. Same person, same intelligence, same world, different starting point, different reasoned conclusion. And the strangest part is how invisible the anchor feels. You don't feel pushed. You feel like you considered the situation and arrived at an estimate. Because again, you don't see the cause. You see the output and the explanation. So the mind's experience of the process is always the same. A conclusion appears. Then the narrator explains why it makes sense. But this rung exposes something important. The mind doesn't search for the right answer first. It searches from wherever it started. And wherever it started can be arbitrary. A number, a word, a mood, a frame, a cue you didn't even notice. That's why you can feel fully in control while the system is being steered upstream. That's rung 8. Even your reasoned estimates can be shaped by a starting point you didn't choose. So here's the full ladder in one line. Thoughts appear, causes stay hidden. Attention is captured by relevance. Automatic outputs arrive first. The narrator claims ownership. Frames steer reactions. Substitution fills in gaps. Cues reshape what feels true. Anchors set the starting point. And reasoning explains the whole thing after the fact. That's the system. Now we can stop treating this like an abstract theory because it has proofs, real ones. You already felt one. The in-color conflict proves it. The automatic output arrives first, even when you know it's wrong. The second proof is something you've lived your entire life. A visual illusion. Imagine two lines on a screen. One line has arrows pointing inward at the ends. The other has arrows pointing outward. You look at them and one line feels longer. Someone tells you they're identical, so you measure them. You put a ruler on the screen. You check the endpoints. They are exactly the same length. And here's the point. Even after measurement, the illusion persists. Your perception keeps delivering the shortcut. Knowing the truth doesn't stop the system from delivering the shortcut, because knowledge doesn't override perception. Knowledge comments on perception. The fast system outputs. The slow system explains. That's why careful thinking doesn't protect you as often as you expect, because the thing you want control over finishes before you notice it. That's why smart people fall for obvious errors, not because they're irrational, because intelligence doesn't replace the machinery. It just makes the explanation smoother. A fast mind generates a conclusion, a smart mind defends it beautifully, and that can look exactly like control, even when it isn't. Now here's where the real world enters. If attention can be captured, attention becomes valuable. And once attention becomes valuable, something predictable happens. Systems evolve to capture it. Not through force, not through argument, through design. Because the mind has known levers. Uncertainty pulls attention. Novelty pulls attention. Threat pulls attention. Incomplete patterns pull attention. So you build things that press those buttons. Infinite scroll doesn't work because you wanted more. It works because the mind treats next like an unresolved search. One more item might contain the thing that matters. A status signal, a threat, a missing answer, a pattern that resolves the loop. Notifications don't work because you ask to be interrupted. They work because interruption is interpreted as possible importance. Headlines don't work because you chose urgency. They work because your attention system prioritizes potential danger and social meaning. And there's one more rung that makes this feel inevitable. Captured attention leads to repeated exposure. Repeated exposure creates familiarity. And familiarity produces a feeling that is easy to confuse with truth. The more something is repeated, the easier it becomes to process. The easier it becomes to process, the smoother it feels. The smoother it feels, the more right it seems. But wait, here's the twist. The mind mistakes ease for truth. Fluency feels like accuracy. Familiarity feels like safety. And safety feels like, I know this. Here's a simple demonstration. Read these two statements. Antarctica is the largest continent. Antarctica is the largest continent. Now read this one. Antarctica is the largest continent. Notice what changed. Nothing about the claim, nothing about the world, only repetition. But the second and third time you read it, the sentence feels smoother, it takes less effort to process, it lands faster, and that smoothness is the danger, because the mind doesn't experience smoothness as I processed this already. It experiences smoothness as this is familiar. And familiarity quietly registers as safe, and safe registers as likely true, even when the claim is wrong. That's why statements can become believable without becoming accurate, not because anyone convinced you. Because your system interprets low friction as reliability. And it happens even when you're intelligent enough to know better. Because again, knowledge doesn't control the shortcut. Knowledge only observes it. The shortcut runs first. The narrator arrives after. And the narrator says, this feels right. Not because you checked it, because it went down easily. So environments that capture attention don't just steer what you notice. They steer what starts to feel normal, what starts to feel obvious, what starts to feel like reality. And there's one last step. Once something feels obvious, it stops feeling like information. It starts feeling like identity. Not as a belief you hold, as a background assumption you are. That's why repeated narratives don't just persuade you, they harden. They become how the world is. They become how people are. They become what's real. And the narrator completes the transformation. It says, I believe this because it makes sense. But often what you mean is, I believe this because it feels familiar. This is measurable. If something is easier to process, you trust it more. If it's repeated, it feels more valid. If it's familiar, it feels safer. Not because you chose that rule, because the system runs on that rule. Not conspiratorial, just mechanical. If a system can be captured, capture will be attempted, because capture works. So the modern world isn't just full of distractions. It is full of things engineered to match your default settings. And then people stare at their lives and ask, why can't I control my thoughts? But control was never the baseline. Control is the rare state where the slow override stays online long enough to matter. Most of the time, the system runs fast. It outputs, it selects, it explains, and the explanation feels like me. So Let's bring this together. You think you control your thoughts. You decide what to focus on. You choose what to think next. Fine. But the structure underneath that feeling is different. You don't observe mental causes. You observe mental results. You don't command attention. Attention is captured by relevance. The mind outputs fast interpretations before deliberate control engages. The inner narrator claims ownership of whatever happened, and reasoning explains the claim. That's why the illusion is so strong, because the system doesn't just produce thoughts. It produces the feeling of authorship. It produces the sense of a single driver behind the eyes. Even though most cognition is automatic, parallel, and invisible, so here's the inversion that makes the whole thing click. Control isn't something you have. It's the feeling you get when the story fits. Thinking isn't a tool you control. It's a system that controls what you notice. Reason isn't designed to be right. It's designed to be fast enough. Your mind doesn't search for truth. It searches for coherence. Not comfort, truth. And once you see that, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. If you're not the one producing most thoughts, who exactly is the you that claims them?